Hello everyone, today we talk about the rise of Italian maritime power during the High Middle Ages. I made already several videos about not just medieval Italy at large, but specifically about the Italian maritime republics. Just recently a video on Amalfi only, I think we started with Schwerpunkt back in the day with a substantial amount of videos on a bit this topic indirectly, because at least speaking of the Mediterranean, that's mostly this Italian dominance to be covered, but also about medieval trade, commerce, naval power, right? Here and there, I made something about naval warfare, specifically the Byzantine, the Italian traditions, and more. And we have really to cover a lot of that. We haven't talked about the Vikings, of course, well, that in the north, but also and properly about Mediterranean naval military culture, because that is, in fact, a topic that, in my opinion, gets dramatically overlooked when talking about, for example, the Italian maritime republics, which is often maybe the only thing you ever hear about Italian communes and city-states, in the sense that, okay, these guys were pretty rich because they traded a lot, and it gets down to the history of the merchant, right? But there is, first of all, an enormous prehistory of this phase, at least something that remains relatively submerged by, let's say, the lack of the early medieval lack of information. But as we will see now, when you see what the Italians were doing, not just from the 11th to 12th, but even from the 10th century, you realize that whatever was going on there, it was in the immediately previous time to that, was not just, these guys at some point got at sea because somebody else was simply dominating it, right? The Saracen era is also deeply misunderstood to a degree. A very large part of the so-called Saracens were Christian, Spanish, Italians, Greeks, right? Yes, within the same Islamic forces. This is true also if you look at the early Islamic invasions from, say, in the Eastern Mediterranean. Of course, Arab forces besieging Constantinople from sea were mostly Christians, right? From Egypt, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, etc. That's a bit of another world, because naturally here we have to focus on the peculiar nature of Italy that was an exception to basically the entire Mediterranean and the entire European continent, compared to other powers that were strong at sea at some point. And that would make, of course, Italy in great part what is also celebrated later for the Renaissance, humanism, etc. But that has this roots fundamentally there. Well, I think that's what we mostly get of it, right? The Italian history is portrayed often like, okay, the Romans and then the Renaissance, and everything laying in between fundamentally seems like, yes, of course, they were rich or urbanized and cultured, whatever, but say obscuring in this sense a bit the political and the military history of the peninsula, which is naturally very complicated. Admittedly, it's very difficult to find even just a basic history of it, because they're either very introductory texts and or something that skips brutally the history of the single centers. That's also the reason why I inserted in the region history series the Italian communes one by one, because until you know their individual history, you can't quite get what that means, right? Understanding the difference between, for example, communes across Europe, or how the city-states established essentially regional powers. Think about Milan, think about Venice, even on land. That's also very important. That not all of them work the same way, but there is also a dramatic homogeneity that is very often just sacrificed in history books behind the notion that, yes, this land was politically divided, But what about how it actually worked? Because it was one of the single most politically, military, and socially compact areas in Europe, right? It's impressive also from a linguistical, cultural point of view, which is, in fact, normally what is not pointed out about Italian history, how actually homogeneous this land was. At least we're talking about center and north of the peninsula, because southern Italy was still actually part of this mechanism, but especially from the 13th to 14th century, things began to, let's say, to differ very much. As they had already, right, from essentially this time, because of the Normans in part, the feudalism, the idea properly of an entire realm established at the expenses of communal autonomies that existed also in the south, but didn't make it to become anything like what was happening in the kingdom of Italy proper and in the Papal States. So all of this should be, of course, borne in mind, and today's video is just observing some of these aspects. For example, the imperial culture, the Roman culture. The fact that very far from being, say, Italy being a peninsula simply dominated by other powers, as it's also often portrayed in all these spaces, was actually an incredibly protagonistic, active, and actually dangerous place. I made some videos about the Italian communal army that doesn't not receive enough love and enough appreciation either, and also this element of maritime power that definitely is one of the most impressive, right, by scale, because when you start appreciating the actual quantities of trade flow that pass through these centers, you really start understanding where all that civilizational output came from. But of course, it's not a passive thing. It's not just because of course, the very advantageous position of the peninsula, the great fertility of it, right? Say in Roman times, Rome had to import grain from Tunisia and Egypt, right? In medieval times, Sicily alone basically exported grain for all the Mediterranean, north and southern shores. Right. Yes, even Egypt, even places like that. And you understand that the reversal there is due to something that was happening from the within of the system that didn't simply have to happen. Right. It's not just the reactivation of transcontinental trade, just the position of the peninsula, or just also the level of urbanization. It's something political and also military nature, and quite aggressive, and that developed through also this naval aptness that remained probably much more developed than we think, even between, say, Roman and this later, say, Crusade era. You can say, that the Crusades were factually possible because of Italian navies, right? There was no other way, essentially, to maintain, not just even to ship the troops, but to just maintain the connections logistically for the supplies and so on. And that's yet another thing that makes you think that we have explored here and there, but the fact that if you look at the Crusades, at least the ones in the Levant, you realize that before the Crusades, the Italians were there. During the Crusades, the Italians were there, and after the Crusades, the Italians were there. So while we tend to see just the Crusade epopee like, okay, this, the history of a couple of 100 years, right, fundamentally, there is a background that, from a Western perspective, should be quite appreciated, because these were literally partly the same people. The timeline is important as well, because it's often sectioned historiographically through these various stages. You have a sort of post-Carolingian phase, then the Crusades, and then, say, the compaction, say, the national monarchies in a way. And of course, Italy escapes, say, not this pattern specifically, because they all had, even for the latter, you have, for example, the Kingdom of Sicily, that still is something of that kind, but it escapes the continuity, right? That these cities politics and warfare was being carried out. Right, I was, say, I think pretty vocal about the continuity between, say, the Romano-Germanic sense of actual freedom, right, understood surely in the sense of liberty, typical of the era, because it was not only God has an absolute freedom in first place, but the fact that that sense of municipal pride, the sense that the cities were, first of all, as communes and city-states, primarily communities of citizens in arms. The fact that Italian communes have their root in a specifically and exclusively military dimension. The consulate was developed by the milites, right? And that's, in fact, the protagonist mostly around this time, because the chronology of Italian communal history is also scanned a bit by this phase. In fact, the consulship, then the podestas, and then the lords, etc. But the city as an institution, right? The commune, the citizen, right, is something incredibly old, and that's why the simple focus on, say, the 10th and late 12th centuries is not often just or maybe the 11th and the 13th, it also depends where you come from with that, is somehow reductive. In any case, also within this chronology, if you focus just on Italian maritime expansion, realize that there are important differences. Again, made plenty of videos already, so I will try to keep this video relatively tidy and compact. But, for example, the 10th century. The 10th century is one of the single most overlooked ones in European history in general, because what we call like the revival of the year 1000 is actually just what we see having been produced by a century, the previous century of dramatic growth. Essentially what we see from around the year 1000 is that people began to document the products, right, of this incredible revival that was going on in spite of the second invasions. Made recently videos about the Ottonians, about the Western Franks. So that also is the age of, even if you look at sea, that you call it the Viking era, but what was actually happening in the Mediterranean, maritime-wide, because I see also there a sort of distortion in the scale and the actual importance of this phenomena. The Mediterranean, again, is understood more like a commercial matter, right? The myth of the Lombard that was fabricated in the Middle Ages, but largely not believed at the time. Again, the sense of civilian, like almost somehow detached from more feudal, military, imperial mentality. That's something that, if of course you studied the institutional history of the Italic kingdom, and also the protagonists of these very actions, as we will see, you can't quite discuss, right? But in the way, of course, we are told history through many media, broadly meant. I mean, it can be also the school, by the way. So much is just, in a sense, not discussed, right? It's not voluntarily obscure. It's just people literally do not know. There are entire, say, sections of world and even Western historiography that literally do not picture certain dynamics, even though they are being enormous in scale. So we arrive today mostly up to the late 12th century, that actually was not even say the 12th century is it's mostly regarded as the century of greatest acceleration in power of the West. The 13th is the richest time, and then there is the crack in the 14th. This is valid in part also for other powers, as we will see now. There is an appendix in this video dedicated to the Byzantines, because you can't really talk here Italian trade without taking Constantinople into account, of course, but still with the due care. So today we focus mostly on the Italian port cities, the Italian maritime republics, whatever you want to call them, and their increasingly dynamic role in Mediterranean trade, right? And this trade would have such a a large volume and scope that it would literally alter the axis of intercontinental trade. All right, this is often, for example, depicted as an east-west route, right? Because naturally, as Westerners, we think, okay, a Venetian trading with Constantinople or Egypt or the Levant is mostly, say, a longitudinal process. But actually, of course, the trade, say, to market squares like the Italian ones in northern Italy, but not only. Right, this is true for Tuscany. This is true also for the for the southern Italian ports. Had an enormous deal to do with the north-south axis in European commerce, right? Because evidently these two areas, just the Crusades alone, right, were deeply intertwined. But here we're talking also about the Holy Roman Empire. You're perfectly aware of the Germanic presence in Italy. The same. Think about the Norman conquest. The Byzantine interference, like the fact that Italy was this sort of huge frontier by some standard, over which literally the dominance of Europe and the Mediterranean was fought, meaning that controlling Italy, and this is obvious, look at the Hohenstaufen, look at the same Byzantines, etc., was really meant the representation of the literal Roman Empire. Bear in mind that at this point, the empire is Roman, not just because there is a Constantinople, but because there is, from Attonian times, an exclusively Roman, and of course, holy Roman Empire in the West. I made tons of videos about the Renovatio Imperii, so, if you just listen to this video for the first time, and all you know is the legalistic Byzantine principle for which there is no other empire but the Byzantine, which is the Roman one, and all the rest does not exist, is just a better copy of it. Just know that this is not really, the best channel to keep fueling that actual delusion, because on a strictly, radically, and brutally and traumatically proper term, archaic and truly Roman term, the imperium is not something that you can restrain by matters of appointment, right, or foreign policy, say diplomatic recognition. It is something that lays in the actual capacity of world domination, which powers like the Hohenstaufen, 12th century Germany, later on the 13th century Capetians, were actually a step away from accomplishing. Right, before his death, Henry VI was actually going to likely seize Constantinople. Before the Sicilian Vespers, Charles of Anjou was about to reconquer Constantinople, and of course in 1204 the Venetians and the French had already literally taken the place. And I made a video about Romania, the Latin Empire, etc., but we will have to come back on that because it's an incredibly subtle moment, also literally the pinnacle of the great medieval civilization, something that essentially the West wouldn't recover after the crisis until essentially the second modern age, and in which universalism was an actual thing. And here you would be surprised maybe to hear what these Italians thought about that. I made already a video about Pisa, but that explains this in detail, but we will see it. So now when we will mention that Tuscan Maritime Republic. So there were several common factors in the success of these maritime republics. So essential assets including their fleets and a capacity to control sea routes. There was essentially no other power elsewhere that could maintain a permanent fleet to the scale and quality that the Italians could. The simple reason was that the trade activities were so intense from the peninsula that it was sufficient for these republics that were run by the same oligarchs that fundamentally ruled the cities. And when I say this, it's not, say, fat merchants. Those would arrive later. Here we're talking about knights, right? These are the same people who fight in the Crusade, who fight in the Reconquista, that arm these ships, that supply them, that invest in them. Like the raids against inland against neighboring cities are aimed at reinvesting specialized crops in this shipbuilding. It's all something that was constantly reinvested to keep on, growing. Under control of the sea routes, at this point, as we will see, were literally monopolized by the Italians. Venice developed its shipping and naval strength by setting up its state-controlled arsenal as early as 1104, and that would remain until the modern era, and actually the first modern arsenal in Western history that gives like a dimension of how the local institutions that were emerging, as we'll see now, from essentially just what was prior a Byzantine duchy in the northeastern Italian lagoons, an actual state based on sea power, right? And of course, this centers owed an important, say, part of their fortune to their geographical, some would say geopolitical. You know that to me, geopolitics does not exist literally for very obvious scientific and moral reasons that I'm sure escape most people would never pose themselves the problem, but this is not the problem. Say, in any case, geography is not decisive, never, right? It's the political situation that today we don't have time to digress on, but you fundamentally know what that these are, except Amalfi, that is in the south, and that will be essentially incorporated in the Sicilian kingdom, part of the Italic kingdom, right? The Italic kingdom was enjoying this period of dramatic autonomy that was also fought for twice against the empire, not against the institution, but in favor of it, and what these communities, as we were saying, were sure of, that is their own rights, right? Their pre-existing rights as free communities in arms, right? That was an absolute privilege, right? This is also an aspect that is often not put forward, because to us, medieval Europe is essentially a place where everybody's a serf de facto, right? Even when being originally free. And so this is like just as a completely dominating feudalism of sort. Well, this is not the case. In Italy, traditionally, people are free, right? There is no comparison with Northern Europe in the sense that those were, more tribal people were freer. No, those realities had actually, one is free in the sense, as long as there is no overlord, right? And if you don't have enough surplus, you may have the impression of being free, effectively, but aside from the clanic aristocratic rule over people that is present everywhere in the same Italy as well, the sense is that given that there is no pre-existing state, right, people form it just like by taking over in an incredibly mob-like fashion. There is no essentially public authority, but a private one, right? In Italy, from Roman times, through the Longobards, through populations that just kept on developing the obviously an already developed civil and urbanized and literate, right, backbone of the Italian Italian culture at that point, established a much more advanced, in fact, institutional, administrative, juridical history, which also explains why everybody wanted to rule the empire from there. Right? That's the reason why the Germans tried to essentially bring under the Italic kingdom and to starting centralizing from there. Otto III ruled from Rome, Frederick II from Sicily. But the Swabian themselves had a literal cultural shock whenever they arrived in places like Lombardy, and they figured out that this system was working in something that from a feudal perspective seemed to work upside down, right? Cities of hundreds of thousands, Milan was the largest in Europe at the time, literally commanding over imperial vassals, right, as imperial subjects themselves, because everybody was, right, technically. And the highest level of per capita wealth in the world, right, ininterruptibly maintained from Roman times, even through the plague, the wars, etc., until the late 17th century, right? So well after even the discovery of the Americas, the opening, say the age of exploration, and so on. So a land like literally no other. There is no comparison to this. There are other communes, there are other city-states, but the quality, and the level especially of interconnection that exists within these cities that are apparently all different, you say, right? There are, after all, 30 different city-states within the Italic kingdom, so you think they're all different. Actually not. They all institute their regimes and the typology of such regimes in the same years, right? Whatever one was doing, they were updating fast to all the others. So this condition, which, as you understand, is, I'm making it very simple, but it has a very powerful background, right? Was an incredible advantage, essentially at the fringes of an empire that defected in most of it the actually direct control territorially for and on the Mediterranean for trade, right, from northern and southern Europe, again, east and western Mediterranean. The capacity, for example, of monopolizing the trade in silks, spices, but also industrial materials, such as alum and cotton, from the wealthy Islamic and Byzantine markets. In exchange for what, though? Because the Italians produced a lot themselves. And some they imported, of course, but we're talking about still stuff that they were famous for production. Iron, for example, especially from Lombardy, timber, salt. Think about the salt, say, fields, the coastal ones in the unsurprisingly, next to the Venetian lagoon, Venice rose, right? Control of, with an incredibly aggressive and violent mindset, by the way. They ousted all the other Italian rivals there to an incredible level of brutality. Slaves, right? For example, Slavic pirates in the Adriatic were often picked and sold to, even when they were still were already Christian, for example, and they had been from a while, frankly, but there were still some pockets of, but they were considered because again, this is a world where when you have power, you can literally do, as we were saying before, whatever the hell you want, right? And this also caused problems because the papacy at some point forbade the selling of Christian slaves and weapons, for example, to the Muslims. But this trade had been going on forever, right? There's not a time, even those initiatives have to be seen in specific contingental situations because, a city like Venice was becoming powerful in as much as also the balance of the Pope, the Empire, the Normans, the Byzantines. So you couldn't quite just always complain about certain things, given that basically this was done a bit by everyone in the same way. The East didn't have much of things like timber, salt, iron, and even slave, at least to just have on a local basis without imports, right? And of course, the Levant, the ports there were the opening branches of the transcontinental Silk Route, so that's a bit the reason why the Crusades were fought, aside from the broader sense of empowerment, of enlightenment and imperial traditional revival of the West, etc., because that's objectively the most advantageous, but it land to expand in, but not only, right? After all, everybody complains about the terrible Crusades. Well, the Romans did the same thing. I mean, it's just a natural expansion. Europeans normally invade those lands, especially if they are richer, as they were at some point. Not at this one, because by the Middle Ages, we radically underestimate normally how dramatically advanced the West already was, right? Again, the myth of the primitive brutes that just invaded this pinnacles of Hellenistic, let's say, Byzantine Islamic centers. It's not truly what corresponds to, right? And especially for countries like Italy, by the way. In part, some of these, the reason why some cities specifically rose to this trade activities were the lack of productive interlands. But these were admittedly exceptions, right? Say the greatest cities in Italy are in Lombardy, in Tuscany, and the most important things that happen in Italy are definitely in the heartland, right? The maritime republics, paradoxically, were not even as magnificent and again as historiographically inquired, etc. They're not the most important thing that goes on, right? There were some Italian interland cities that were far richer than literally any other place in the world. Florence, that doesn't have any access to the sea, also for a long time, until the very end of the Middle Ages, is literally the richest city in the entire world by the late 13th, early 14th century, right? Milan, of course, is also the most powerful, and all of these, mostly the leagues that are formed against Barbarossa, Frederick II, etc. But that power is always there, right? It's used against one another, and some of these maritime republics actually have a problem with that. Venice is isolated, evidently enough, on the lagoons. That's also why it prospers, because nobody can quite invade it. Genoa also has just mountains in the hinterland, so you can't even technically expand there. Amalfi is the same, and it's actually the first because, say, at least at the beginning of the Middle Ages, say, southern Italy was better put than the north. Then eventually things changed over time during the High Middle Ages, especially. Also, Pisa is actually the only one of these major ones, because there were other republics, maritime republics, such as Ancona, Gaeta, etc., Naples, the same Naples, Bari, Salerno, etc. But in that case, in fact, you see that Pisa has quite active terrestrial activity. It's actually one of the most powerful city-states in Italy, and I made a video about medieval Pisa in 2 episodes that explains that a little better, but we'll come back on it. Just to say that the exploit at sea, also militarily speaking, we will see especially in Genoa and Pisa in the Reconquista, are the least important compared to what happens in Italy. But of course, historiographically, you have, especially I think in the last generations, the sense that we studied history because it's about multicultural stuff. It's about, different peoples coming together, like in this great open world of different ideas, but actually until even these exchanges seem such a great deal, but they were just a normal thing, right, of a system that was not, of course, just economical. Right, economics is not even one of the most important things. It's just a branch, say, of social studies. Then you have of equal importance the military, politics, just to make the Clausewitzian Trinity society, military and politics. But again, this bias towards, let's study what medieval merchants did. I mean, I don't know about you. I'm not a historian of economics, as you know. I think it's extremely boring, at least until you connect this with actual political, military history and social history, right? In any case, some of these cities, especially the ones with the mountains in their rear, were just obliged to get into long-distance trade. Amalfi became more prosperous than the same Naples that had been a relevant city and still was, as a market, agriculturally, as a port, etc. Amalfi was literally born in the early Middle Ages. We don't even think it existed in ancient times, or at least it was just like a sort of village, port, of whatever. But it rose to much greater importance than Naples in maritime trade, in spite of, again, the much less fertile territory, interland. Naples had also textile industries, yet Amalfi is also a place where it's a bit like Switzerland, right? You can't quite simply take these places because they have the mountains protecting them and the sea, and these guys are the strongest at sea. So you can't. The Normans struggled, in fact, to take these avamposts because, also strategically speaking, it was quite complicated. Nobody really ever took Venice, right, until Napoleon. That didn't, just had to march in at that point. But the thing is, this natural obstacles really matter as far as the fortune of the cities is concerned. Definitely the key of Amalfi's early success was its close relations with Islamic centers of trade, probably including the Al-Andalus and the ports of Maghreb and Sicily, and certainly Cairo. Right, as we will see, the Italian connection with Egypt was very old, almost like, Augustan times. And the important about Amalfi is that it was dramatically close. This, just like Naples, were former Byzantine duchies, right? So they technically belonged to the empire, but they had autonomized themselves in a time in which the Saracens had the upper hand in the Mediterranean in general. And naturally, the Amalfitans exploited that. At some point, they allied themselves with the Saracens. But you realize it's a bit just like with the Vikings or the Magyars, that these invaders succeeded only in the measure in which the locals, the continental Europeans, allowed them to do so as mercenaries to just harass a neighbor, etc. Because there wasn't, as it is evident from the 10th to the 12th century and beyond, there wasn't any chance, like for example, of North Africa to have these guys were mostly sponsored by Cordoba, that was a powerful state and all, but there was no way to actually, control any northern Mediterranean shore just from a power coming from, say, North Africa. Was dramatically less populated than it. And obviously enough, this was just because those who lived there allowed them to do. Think about the Saracen base of Fraxinetum in Provence, right? They existed as long as the Ottonians and the Cordobans negotiated on it. As long as the deal was broken, the Counts of Provence marched on Fraxinetum and destroyed it, without even, without difficulties in that regard. So that if you start understanding properly, also the Saracen era in those terms, you get mind blown. In any case, the Amalfitans were also active in Constantinople, as we've seen in that video. Still, the local magistrates, patricians, etc., were conferred power by the empire. They were present also in Antioch, all by the early 11th century. And despite being forcibly brought under Norman rule in 1073 and losing commercial advantages to the northern Italian cities, Amalfi still had an important focus of trade at the end of the 12th century. These were probably also very advanced areas. Think about Salerno, the famous medical school, all the prestige that derived eventually from the establishment of the Norman kingdom in the south. We have a record around the 20s of the 11th century showing merchants from Amalfi, Gaeta, and Salerno, along with the Venetians, already established in Pavia, the old capital of the Italic kingdom, which means that they weren't just operating in the Mediterranean. They also were present in the continental trade. Literally moving goods, right? Going in person there and dealing with it, having their own mob, making their own business. They brought to places like Lombardy spices, silks, other luxuries, and where they would find goods from beyond the Alps as well. So they were present, of course, also in Central Europe, at least, in some cases also in Northern Europe by this point. So, but at the same time, Venice was enjoying favorable trading conditions in Constantinople. Venice, as we reminded, was yet another Byzantine duchy, right? One of the lagoons. So you see this early connection, because technically these were all Roman cities, right? Because Venice emerged fundamentally in the early Middle Ages, Amalfi as well. These are a bit exceptions, but places like Bari, where Bari was an old Hellenic colony in classical times. The same goes for, say, Naples. They had complex histories also, that the Etruscans had arrived up to there, etc. But I mean, historically, that had always served that function, right? And Pisa as well. Pisa had at some point been taken over by the Longobards, that seized the Byzantine dromons that were present in the port and began to raid Byzantine Sardinia. We are between the 6th and the 7th century. So that function was already illustrated there. There were some Tuscan, there was the Count of the famous Boniface of Tuscany, who in Carolingian times raided Tunisia from Tuscany, notoriously. I made also a video about Byzantine Sicily that explains a little bit what also the Sicilian relation with Tunisia before the Aghlabid conquest of the same Sicily really were. That also kind of blows your mind. And because of the degree of cooperation that these ambitious rulers really had, also conflict, but let's say how you can't quite see a mere, say, conquest in the brutal, in Sicily would happen actually in the brutal sense, but how the system would have not worked if there had not been a local support of some kind, right, the size of one. So the Byzantine mark here is also the mark of Rome initially. Genoa was a Roman city. Pisa was a Roman city. And you have more examples of this. Venice had, by the beginning of the 11th century, de facto established control of Dalmatia, as you were saying before, and Adriatic shipping as a consequence. Very important was the Strait of Otranto between Apulia and Epirus, that naturally, if blocked, would have bottled the Venetians in their Adriatic lake. A reason for which they cared, they took control internationally of matters like, not making anyone being on those two shores too strong, at least to threaten the Venetian passage. But it's obvious that the Venetian relations with Constantinople were very strong historically. I don't have to remind also all the international relevance that Venice had already had from an early time, the 9th century, in between the Carolingians and the Byzantine Empire. Charlemagne's son died of malaria in the Venetian lagoons during the siege of Venice. Venice had somehow recognized a margin of, say, of authority to the Western Empire, which was an issue for the Byzantines as well, but the Byzantines needed these Italian merchants, as we'll learn now, as basically anybody in the Mediterranean, for financial reasons. And so this is a bit the beginning of that toxic relationship between the Latins and the Greeks that would culminate in the sack of Constantinople in 1204, right? Venice's great wealth and her special relations to Constantinople were expressed, for example, in the lavish rebuilding of the civic church of St. Mark, right? And St. Mark is not a coincidence here, because the story goes that St. Mark's relics were brought from Egypt by the Venetians at some point. It's a bit between history and legend, but the Venetian contact, not just with Constantinople, but also with Egypt, with the Nile Valley, was very old, and Italians were present there for quite a while that we don't get, and that evidently happened when the Arabs were still essentially in control, or at least had the upper hand on the Mediterranean. And the Venetians, yes, there was some, say, Saracen piracy in the Adriatic, but say places like Genoa, Venice were a bit more sheltered. In 1022 we have the Golden Bull, of Venice, so-called, that is essentially a reward that the Byzantine Empire confers, bestows to the Venetians in return for the Italian support against the Normans at the Battle of Dyrrhachium in the previous year. And consider that already at this point the Byzantines start having serious problems. They have already lost the Anatolian hinterland to a large degree to the Turks. The empire, I made a video about Alexius Comnenus' rise to the first issues with the Normans themselves, that were actually the greatest threat to the empire, such. Well, the Byzantines needed desperately because navies cost really a lot, right, just to keep them, etc. As we've seen, the Italians just had them on their own and used them privately, and at some point the city-state could say, look, we need some of these forces to attack somebody, right, to defend ourselves, and it could simply put together this very large maritime forces. Nobody else really had in this measure, and we're talking even about single. Like, we don't have... Yes, there were some cooperations between the Italian maritime republics, as we will see now, but, say, the potential of every single city was pretty large just by its own. So the Venetians were meant to play as a deterrent against other invaders, to supply, say, the Byzantines, just by civilian trade, right? And so keeping the empire well blooded, well pumped in oxygen, etc. The reason for which this reward sees the extensive commercial privileges in Constantinople provided to the Venetians, including a quarter on their own, probably the first such district to be controlled by an Italian city, because this would become a bit the standard everywhere. Every major Mediterranean port had these quarters in the port, and they were quite... say it was not a positive thing for at least those who inhabited there, meaning that the powers were often not maritime powers as such. I mean, you can look at Venice and say, this is literally a maritime power, because it's technically just a city and it has just coastal possessions, right? But if you say, I don't know, the Egyptian Sultanate or the same Byzantine Empire, these are technically not, say, they can be naval powers at times, but they're terrestrial powers, right? They have completely different problems, and they need this open access to trade. And they do so by installing essentially a pocket of actually foreign armed forces in very often the best citadels of the, or at least quarters that would evolve as heavily fortified strongholds within the major ports of their country. You first have, and you have, again, there is the Venetian quarter, the Genoese quarter, the Byzantine quarter, etc., that often also engulf the entire city and destroy it because they're fighting against each other. And you could even you could kick them out, could confiscate their goods, you could imprison them, you could kill them, things like that. But after that, first of all, you would have to pay something for it, and these guys you needed anyway to come back and to make business proceed once again. So again, that's the toxicity of such relation. And in the meanwhile, the Italians are making a disproportionate amount of money compared to any other power in relative terms because of this. And all these powers are growing dependent on that. Because at that point, the Italian ships are there. And at this point, there is already, of course, some specialization of vessels in terms of what is more like a cargo ship or a warship, but technically they're both at the same time. So technically what you have is this navy is already controlling your ports, which is even more problematic. It was just possible, right? The Byzantines, for example, could create fleets on their own, but they cost a lot. We had just these Italians that had everything ready. You didn't even have to ship build, right? They just provided you with this ships that eventually they just upkept by themselves without asking you, in that sense, anything for it, but just this further trade rights, right? Commercial privileges in your city. And in a sense, you would keep indebting yourself, making yourself, if anything, ever more dependent on their activity just to finance your empire, your kingdom, your sultanate, whatever. And this is the mechanism that sees the spread, the dominance of the Italian maritime republics. The Venetians, for example, obtained rights in the Holy Land in 1100 too, because the Crusades had been born like that, right? It was thanks also to the Genoese, the Pisan, for example, naval engineering, siege engineering. It was very advanced in Italy. That even just, for example, Jerusalem was taken. Godfrey of Bouillon was very, provided the Italians also with significant privileges because of the military help received. I also made a video about the siege of Acre of 1291. There you find out that some Italian contingents, not even from maritime republics, places like Umbria, etc., had come there, and they were the last to withdraw. Of all, even of other, military, orders, revealing an incredibly pugnacious temper that was definitely developed within the clash between the same Italian city-states. I mean, the single most Contamine is clear about this, but other authors have just, confirmed this abundantly, that the highest degree of belligerence, the greatest amount of resources spent for war, do not find equal anywhere in Europe in centuries like the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, like in Italy. It's a continuous war. It's a continuous, and you see, just this naval culture makes you ever bolder, makes you ever, widens your horizon, right? Even just culturally speaking. That's where cartography is born. That's where mathematics, banking, accounting, all this stuff is developed because, of course, they needed it. As much as they needed to make war, they needed technologies, they needed, as we've seen, they had the best arms and armory production. It was, first of all, a business model as the one would emerge as the biggest one. They had the means, they had the know-how, they knew how to go get things that they needed, because that was also the reason why they went there. And we're not talking just about material, we're talking about knowledge, books, manuscripts, right? This is true in general for Europeans at this point that went to still Islamic held till later to just find Greek, Hebrew manuscript that they already knew how to translate in this terribly dark age of ignorance. They literally knew this. It's not just that they knew those languages or that they had the curiosity. They knew that there was such manuscript there. I mean, just think how advanced Europe really was. This is way before the humanism and the Renaissance that, no, were not triggered by a bunch of Byzantine refugees escaping with all their surely precious manuscripts, but, when the Renaissance already existed. And there would have not been a use for those manuscripts in the Renaissance if it had not already existed as such. And this is yet another concept that stems from, again, this dark legend about the Middle Ages in general, etc. And there is much to it, right? As we will see, the church had much to do with this naval expeditions as well. And if you understand that papal history has been demonized since the modern age for political, confessional reasons, etc., in great part also the reason why we consider the Middle Ages dark has to do with not even, wanting to obscure objectively this history, not accepting. It's a matter of cognitive dissonance, right? That this was a civilization and that it stemmed exactly from the heart of what you consider as the most evil, morally corrupt stuff thing. And, well, that should provide you, well, that's also why I make these videos in the first place, with something else to think of. Surely the Venetians had acquisitions in the ports that they helped to conquer, including a district within Acre and a third in Tyre. About the military contributions, again, there's plenty of examples. Think about the Battle of Arsuf, right? Richard Lionheart uses his crusading cavalry with combined arms with the Pisan crossbowmen on the wings, and these guys win against the Egyptian horse archers, which makes you understand also how absolutely anti-historical the sense of the clumsiness of the crossbow, or for whichever reason they would have used it, if it was not effective, etc. repeatedly. And that's yet another chapter that I just give you in the medieval warfare playlist, where we talk extensively about these things, and intensively as well. So even though the Christian conquest of Palestine seems to have initially caused a still somewhat also lasting setback of the size and wealth of its towns, such gains were important sources of income in their own right. Those were fertile areas. That's a horn of the Fertile Crescent, after all. One thinks that the desert, the semi-arid areas, they were actually productive, and plus they had their Silk Route branches there. For the Italians, whose interests there were largely confined to the port, to a certain degree wisely enough, because they weren't searching for territorial expansion, they just wanted to control those ports, right? They made even more sense commercially as staging posts on the most efficient shipping routes between Venice, Constantinople, Alexandria, and the Maghreb. Again, they saw them as commercial waterland bridges, right? They, of course, it would have not made sense for any of these powers to seize actual interland, right? You have a few exceptions like Crete, that, however, is also very narrow. It's not really a major landmass, right? The Venetians do control the coasts. There are private Venetians, say, that live there as local lords, and that are something different from the government of Venice. That's also a fascinating aspect of the story, that there are, say, Italian knights that install themselves here and there in Mediterranean, but they do so in a essentially autonomous way. It's a bit like, I don't know, what the Anglo-Normans do in Ireland, right, or things like that. Everybody does it. It's what the Vikings did at some point early in the day. There is this business, there is this mercenarism involved. I mean, in the 13th century, you find, Italian crossbowmen used in the Indian Ocean by the Ilkhanate of Persia at Similia, together with Frankish knights or something like that. So that's how convenient it may be to just widen your horizon. Of course, these cities, in a way, would have, if they had wanted to expand territorially, as, for example, Venice would do, Pisa would do, it would do it in Italy. They wouldn't do it somewhere else, overseas, right? They cared about the strongholds on the coasts, because that's where the river mouths were, where the trade routes passed. Why messing up with the interland? Who the hell cares, right? Stay out of there. Nobody will harass you, right? Unless, somebody wants to dislodge you from those fortified quarters, which then does become a problem. But also a pretty costly one from the other side as well. The career of a seaman and merchant, like, for example, Romanus Myranus, between 1155 and 1190, reveals how Venetians used this network. We are exactly at the time of just before the Third Crusade. This guy raised loans and shipped timber to Constantinople for a living. Then, as a shipmaster at a point, he sails between Constantinople, Smyrna, Acre, and Alexandria, being absent from Venice for 9 years in the process. Make a lot of fortune, right? Later, as a sedentary and established ship owner, he borrows and invests to finance trade between Venice, Constantinople, and Alexandria, organizing a voyage from Alexandria to the Maghreb, and himself returning to sea in the Levant. So this is quite eloquent, because you see that these guys could simply leave on sailing as such. They knew they had these bases, having multiple of them, of course, diversifies a great deal of this investment. And still, they are aware of the fact that this empire is not going to end, because again, there is technically nobody that can threaten the establishment as a whole. You can have certain cargoes taken, you can have sinking, you can have, I don't know, some retaliation from Italian rivals or the local authorities overseas because there is a problem between your government and that one. But overall, this presence is destined to remain. There's no force that is capable of ousting that on its own. You have to await the Ottomans to do this, and almost, because still they do need the Venetians, even after having made dislodging from Cyprus, from Greece. It's so. These are centuries during which these people just continuously make back and forth through these activities. By the mid-12th century, Venice has also acquired footholds in Palermo and probably in Bari, right? That were a long, important center of shipping, and so a focus of Venetian attention. This aspect is quite important. I made videos about the kingdom of medieval Sicily in general, and we have seen how, of course, this feudal kingdom has a bit the same problem, because southern Italy has actually a lot of ports of, in fact, coastal towns, arsenals, whatever. But the Norman monarchy, of course, prevents these centers from, say, developing into city-states that can't quite do whatever they want on their own as major centers. They, however, need still a maritime power, a good commercial connection. They just can't play on also this Italian maritime rivalries to at their own benefits, but still they have fundamentally to accept that while building a fleet, right, a royal fleet on their own costs a lot, and you have to maintain it, and you have to build it back and forth again. These guys have a ready, omnipresent naval force, and they can't simply land in the cities, taking over what they want, making a mess. So the best way to actually operate with them is to choose at least which field you want it to be, or also making them settle like in different quarters for each town, and playing on them there, but not much else, right? You need also to as we've seen, invade the Byzantine Empire, going to Crusades, etc. So you need this well trained crews. You need the maritime strategic insight of these naval cultures to make things work, and they do work, by the way. Also because Sicily, as we were saying before, has a lot to export, so you want to export through the right channels, and these are the best ones, for sure. Palermo is the capital of the Sicilian kingdom. Bari, as we've seen, is an old center, also Greek in language, because it remains somehow Hellenic in areas that the hinterland is Italic. They speak Romance, but the city there is also a sort of bulwark of Byzantineness, right? The Byzantines from the other side are, just like the meme crying, while negotiating with the Venetians, but, having the smiley mask, but crying underneath it, because these guys control Bari together with the Haute-Ville. So it's really a matter of great affirmation over these centers. I mean, it was important for them just to live in their own cities and to have this enormous pride about the same. And so just think about what it felt in the first place, just to literally control so many other places. And of course, all the prestige that internationally this conferred them, right? Venice negotiated the peace, helped at least brokering and hosting the peace treaty at the end of the war between Barbarossa and the Lombard League. I mean, it was one of those centers that everybody recognized being important, right? A bit also connected to the Byzantine board, so having all the right connections with Germany, with Italy, etc. The division of spoils between Venice and the Latin Emperor of Constantinople, of course, at the conquest of the city in 1204, was a natural outcome of this long tradition of opportunistic acquisition. The Venetians, when the Crusaders take Constantinople, take away an enormous amount of works of art, some of which you can still see in Venice, the famous quadriga of the Hippodrome of Constantinople, St. Mark, an enormous amount of classical antiquities, of manuscripts and so on, and they refuse the interland, right? By right of conquest, the Venetians could have claimed just one chunk of the Latin empires, one of these fiefs that are formed continentally. They say, no, all we want is the coastal centers and running them, right? And so basically managing the trade of the Byzantine Empire and the Latin Empire at that point, without the nuisance of ruling, administering the empire, the interland, the people inhabit. They couldn't give a damn about that, and they were wise, right? They were smart about that, because who cares, right? The Latin Empire, as you know, was not a particularly successful enterprise, while, again, Venetian presence there definitely was. Venice definitely is the most important of the Italian maritime republics. Amalfi is also the first, so they all have their own mythology and and profile. But I think overlooked are the Pisan and Genoese exploit, especially in the Western Mediterranean, right? Because we all know of later times. I also made a video recently about the Genoese presence in the Black Sea, the Crimean strongholds, some of which can still be admired, beautiful, massive fortresses. Think about the Sudak ones. There are later Middle Ages, of course, but that's how far Genoa goes, even when it's, ousted as the major force in the Eastern Mediterranean, after having helped the Palaiologoi to reconquer Constantinople against the Venetians. But in the 11th, in the 12th century, what Pisa and Genoa do in the Western Mediterranean is quite fascinating, and it should be appreciated a bit more. We will surely keep talking about this in some depth, also from a military point of view. Because these guys are the ones who most concretely sweep the Mediterranean of Saracen presence, right? The Pisan and Genoese navies are the ones that basically crush Islamic maritime power. By the way, in an area where it had been consistently strong, because as we were saying before, the Cordoban Caliphate had been basically the major sponsor of also the Saracen piracy that hit Italy in the central Mediterranean, and let's say the Eastern Mediterranean was more depending on Egypt fundamentally, as far as the Saracen activity really was. At this time, of course, the Caliphate in Cordoba enters a deep crisis, and these Italian coastal cities immediately pass to counterattack. Right, it would have done it anyway at some point, but of course the process is speeded up as much as the Reconquista one by the same Italians at sea, coastally, right? Especially Aragon, as we will see now, was consistently backed by these navies, especially for besieging the coastal cities, because you had to blockade them from the sea, otherwise it would have been useful, right? That the Catalans, the Aragonese, still at this point are not that seaborne as they would become in a couple of centuries, right? So again, already at the beginning of the 11th century, we have these Italian seamen carrying that out. In 1015, 1016, Pisans and Genoans drive the Saracens out of Sardinia. Right, these two cities would become, and already were by a degree, rivals. Right, they would clash against one another. Genoa would win after the Battle of Meloria in 1284, just off Pisa. They would at that point simply say, very practical mind and say, okay, well, the Genoese have the largest market now. Let's simply invest in it ourselves. And actually, the city had, as we've seen, a continental, say, an interland, where they would keep on expanding as one of the strongest forces in early 14th century Italy. They could field armies of 30,000 men, just like, I don't know, the Kingdom of France could do. Right? That's the scale of military power. There is a general consideration that wants these guys to be the best crossbowmen around. Yes, it is true. To a degree, probably naval warfare had developed them like that, but generally speaking, they also lived in an interland where that was quite advanced on its own, so just they were probably adding a bit more that maritime, technical pioneering, but it doesn't mean that these were the only guys who were good at crossbow warfare, right? Italian infantry, as you know, were pretty courageous at this time. They were definitely the most advanced in Europe in general, right? And not just thanks to these guys that, as we've seen, were more navally oriented, but did also fight occasionally on land pretty large battles, right? Pisa, specifically in the early 14th century, probably the largest battle in Europe, possibly even medieval Europe. I mean, if you look at the size, it's surely the amount of wealth that entire army cost, the wealth of communal armies in general. They had pretty good then cavalry. Again, don't think that if these were not feudal powers, they didn't have good cavalry. Actually, they had, or they could simply hire mercenaries, and to great effectiveness, telling the truth. So, in 1035, the Pisans seized Bona in Algeria in 1063. During the Norman conquest of Sicily, they sacked Palermo. You know, just now that the Normans are conquering the island, of course, they can assist by randomly plundering these Islamic centers that are about to fall into Christian hands. Of course, all these operations are mixed, right? Not the Pisans are not just passing by randomly. They are coordinated with the Normans and the Pope and others. So, as powerful as Genoa and Pisa became, they became rivals, as we've seen. They began to fight as early as 1067 to 1085. Periodically during the 12th century. Again, I made a video both about medieval Genoa and medieval Pisa, so you can see both sides' stories regarding that. Also, the two maritime cities unite in 1087 with a contingent from Rome and perhaps another from Amalfi in the sack of Al-Madiya in Tunisia, an expedition presumably intended to gain a position at the fulcrum of East-West trade. We're talking about the Sicilian Strait with North Africa, so these were definitely crucial centers that needed to be taken out, just to, like I said, they weren't dramatically powerful in ship say availability like already this republics were, but surely they were hosting pirates. They were troublemakers of a sense. So in fact, these expeditions, you realize here, coordinated already with the papacy. Crusades really began before the first one, and these are some of them. Technically, they're all imbued with a strong religious concern, right? An alignment with their forming papacy, the sense that there is an order, like they're all part again of the Crusades. One thinks of the Crusade just as the Near East ones, right? That's the big deal. But here they were happening. In Spain they were happening. In the Baltic Sea they were happening a bit everywhere, right? And everything was already, again, going in the name of God, right? That's not what the the Crusades were in an innovative sense, like from 1095, 1096, right? What actually matters here is that there is a papacy with a monarchic profile that directs them as the guidance of say, the setting of objectives for lay authorities to follow, which is a completely different thing that had, as it had been existing before, at least at that level of coordination, not in the essence of holy war that was, again, the basic concept behind any war that had always been fought since ever, way before Christianity, and that all these people believed in from ever, right? That thing had never changed. Even regarding the let's say the rewards, heavenly and earthly, etc. And for these people, of course, was, you understand, a moral expansion, a moral a sense of confidence, of aggression, of will to power. Pisa and Genoa collaborated, for example, also in the attacks on Valencia and Tortosa. Here we are on the Spanish coast in 1092, 93. Then in the First Crusade, to which they were dramatically instrumental. And from then on, the two cities were as much involved in the Eastern as in Western Mediterranean, so that we know more of the former, telling the truth. But the Western activities are also fascinating because they go on for a consistently long time, right? But also when the Aragonese the Catalans become more like competitors in the 13th century, that the Genoese do not hesitate to ally themselves with the Nasrids of Granada because it's convenient to them. The Genoese had been trading in Egypt by the 60s of the 11th century. They acquired a base in Antioch in 1098. And in 1104, in return for providing naval support, shares in the ports of Palestine. They have the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, right? They also received by the Crusaders a promise of a share in Cairo were it to be captured. And as you know, the Crusaders did attempt at some point to conquer Egypt on actually multiple occasions. Genoa seems to have been trading in Constantinople by the 30s of the 12th century at the latest, right, acquiring rights in the Byzantine capital in 1155. Also a compound soon afterwards. Again, the later Genoese presence in Constantinople is very famous. Think about the Galata Tower across the Golden Horn, still a landmark of what I still call Constantinople personally. The Turkish followers will want to massacre me. Now, Pisa already had rights in Palestine, the Palestinian ports in 1111. That is the same time when it gained a quarter in Constantinople. And in Constantinople, as you understand, the rivalry between the Italians was very fierce and hot, because that was the most important square, and more was at stake. Say, Byzantine policy was so far-ranging in general that here again there is no time to digress on, say, why the Pisans and the Genoese were there. Again, that's the point I was making in the beginning. It's not just trade, right? There is a very strong political, strategic importance here going on with the empire, with the Normans. These are the same time in which, for example, in 1162 the Pisans attacked the Genoese. In 1170-71 the Venetians helped them to destroy the Genoese compound. So we were at the time of Manuel I. So when the Byzantines attempt the almost successful conquest or destruction of the Sicilian kingdom, that failed miserably anyway, but had almost brought to a sort of even a reunification of two churches or stuff like that. And much of the background is also this constant Italian rivalry, because one side prevailing over the other could mean very different strategies, very different policies. In the course of the 12th century, Pisa, Genoa, and other northern Italian towns, including Lucca, that was an important trade center close to the sea, not quite a maritime republic, and Florence, obtained footholds in Sicilian ports. Right, this was becoming ever more important because, by the way, these cities were literally enlarging. Like at some point, they built the third city ring, right, from the original Roman one, for how many people lived in there. Consider that they were overcrowded, right? This is the characteristic of medieval cities in general compared to the Roman ones. They had as many people living within the city and the suburbs than in the city district, right? So that gave a dimension. And as we've seen, these are some of the largest cities in Europe alone. So the Sicilian grain was a big deal for feeding the mob. And they, in fact, likely at this point, the cities exported from Sicily, because their merchants were there, wheat, but also leather. Of course, there were other commodities traded. In 1162, after Frederick Barbarossa captured Milan, the emperor promised both Pisa and Genoa extensive interests in Sicily, should they help him conquer the kingdom. A promise that was renewed by Frederick's son Henry VI in 1191. Now, this aspect is fascinating because, especially Pisa was a very strongly pro-imperial city. Right? The Pisans specifically believed that they were a Roman city in the proper sense of the word since the time of the Roman Empire. It was not a re-edition of the thing. They literally had remained identically Roman. And even if under, say, in an Italic kingdom and a Lombard one before, but say their entire cultural identity was about that sense of the urbs of the city, and of the empire. They literally believed they were the spearhead of the Roman Empire in the Western Mediterranean, and technically they were, right? They supported Barbarossa and Henry VI because they realized that they would have been the only centers in Italy benefiting from a Germanic affirmation on the Italic kingdom, meaning cities like Milan, etc., in the hinterland would have remained fundamentally under, say, a strong, if the imperial plan had succeeded, which it wouldn't, but they would have been some sort of hammered down. They would have been powerful centers, but hopefully under the control, also economical one, and of the imperials, which is a bit the reason why they took up arms, and because they were to be the spoil literally of basically every income that the emperor claimed to be publicly in the typically Roman fashion. This is the most interesting thing. As you know, Barbarossa boosted dramatically the recovery of Roman law in the Bolognese Studium, etc. And Pisa and Genoa, if, say, they would have, in this scenario, would have just been let autonomous, because the more autonomous they would have been as individual cities that could not challenge an Italian mainland under a single monarchy, just including the same cities, would have still dramatically increased the importance in trade of the empire. Right? So they, especially Pisa, felt an incredibly, important Ghibelline power by vocation. Right, and it's not that these centers were just doing so because they were, eager to be part of a stronger empire. They wanted to be powerful themselves, but they understood that this was the case, and at some point the Holy Roman Emperors had literally to flatter these powers to to give them other privileges and rights, monetarily, in commercially, etc., in order to receive loans, troops, right? Pisa contributed dramatically from a military and a financial point of view to the Ghibelline cause. And as a consequence, they were getting what given in exchange, actually, well, these Sicilian ports, right? The thing was obvious. It's a bit like later when, in the 13th century, Charles of Anjou was without money. He indebted himself with the Tuscan bankers of the Guelph cities. And that's why essentially by the 14th century, the Angevin Naples is run economically by Tuscan subcontractors, Florentines, Sienese, because they had subcontracted the entire grain exports of Sicily and at Similia. So here, while Henry VI was fighting against Tancred of Lecce to take control of his reign after his marriage with Constance, the loss of the Haute-Ville, he was simply saying, "Well, look, I need naval support in southern Italy. I will give you Pisa and Genoa this rights, so that you will support me in the actually successful, as it would have revealed itself, war of say in southern Italy." And as we were saying before, this was just a constant indebting of these feudal powers that couldn't quite. Today we stopped to the 12th century, but I mean by the 13th it was evident, even just in the wars against the Lombard League, etc., that these were becoming literally something else. Like the cities were taking a truly statal direction, in having essentially a concentrated government, not just a bunch of oligarchs acting. Especially Pisa and Venice were very unitary in their institutional mechanisms. Genoa would admittedly remain a bit more privatistic. It would become just a large bank run by the major families that were always somehow clashing against one another. But I mean, these were the same powers that in the 16th century could finance the Spanish Empire as such alone. We were talking about single cities without essentially any other landmass or whatever after the Fuga in that case. So this tells you the sheer amount of wealth that they owned. This was convenient for a great empire. They were incredibly rich and it could finance them, but they weren't major land masses that could threaten their own their own holdings, right? Say in a sense they could do it, because again, if they had taken away their support, they would have caused, often say at least they could have been the tip of the balance. But of course, say Pisa or Genoa would have never thought, say, to conquer Sicily, right? It didn't make any sense, as we've seen. They didn't have maybe they even would have had the manpower to threaten such thing, but how would they justify, how would they internationally put themselves at the level, by the way, of royal blood, because that was an issue. These were republics, it was commoners, right? So it's a delicate as intricate situation. And one of their aims was rather to control the distributive trade within the Western Mediterranean. It was much more lucrative in the first place. From the early 12th century onwards, they Pisa and Genoa gained trading rights, housing, and fondaci. Fondaci is an Italian term that comes from the Arab funduk, which means warehouse or something like that. As you know, most still modern commercial, like naval terms, admiral, things like that, they all come from Arab through the Italianization of the term, because at the time that these were the only people who essentially gradually passed from one another this technical language of navies, shipbuilding, commerce, trade, etc. Think about maths, think about, it's very, very notorious, to say the least. This the Genoese and the Pisans seized a lot of these centers also in the Western Mediterranean. For example, in the busy ports of Provence. Provence was very connected with Liguria and Tuscany, because that was the Tyrrhenian way Ligurian way from which trade would flow from the Rhone mouth into to northern France, the Champagne fairs, hence connected to the textile industry of Flanders, the wool one of England, etc. Also, the county of Toulouse and Catalonia see Genoese and Pisan quarters. The Italians also consolidate their interests in the Maghreb. Right, they go as far as Black Africa, either through the Sahara or also along the coast. Perhaps the ivory, slaves, gold. So they controlled that, right? They were there to slave trade, etc. Also, they continued to attempt to establish position in Andalusia, which is fascinating because at this time the land is still Islamic, right? So they don't really care who's who there, that there are Christians that are fighting from the other side. They just want to make money to use the thing at their own advantage. As we were saying before, whenever their interests were threatened, they wouldn't hesitate to just attack. As we've seen, they took away the Saracens because they were just in between them and the riches. If now the Catalans arose, well, they would try to do the same. By the 70s of the 12th century, there are also other centers in the area. In fact, emerging Montpellier, for example, was noted for its many merchants from the Levant, Egypt, and even England. Montpellier, as you know, is in southern France, and so the Genoese and the Pisans were amongst other merchants. By the beginning of the 13th century, merchants from Provence and Catalonia had gained commercial privileges in Tyre as well. Those from Marseille were trading in Sicily. They would never be as important in the east as the Italians, but as you know, the Catalans would essentially service their maritime power to the King of Aragon to take over gradually the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, Sicily, etc. This happens mostly in the 13th century. That's the peak a bit of. I made a video about medieval Catalonia, right? But that comes, for example, at the expense of Genoese preeminence in the Mediterranean, also because the Venetians are paying the Catalans for that, and that's where the Genoese opened the Atlantic route with England, passing the Gibraltar Strait, and even opening technically the age of explorations, because in the meanwhile they're hired by the Spanish, by the Portuguese, and most of the early, but even for a long time, like the crews, the admirals, also the ones in the wars, say the French used not just Genoese crossbowmen on land, but also at sea, together with the Doria admirals, for example, etc. Well, they were Italians by the majority, right? I made a video about medieval Castilian the medieval Castilian fleet in the late Middle Ages, explaining how this mechanism occurred, because again, these powers were not normally providing themselves with anything like a permanent fleet. Egypt would mobilize a fleet, for example. Again, there was a major naval power, but this meant they could create a fleet for a specific objective, a specific campaign. It was just also supporting troops on land or landing them somewhere, but then they would disband it. Instead, again, these powers had always a large amount of ships available and continuously upkept, replaced, modernized, etc. So the great expeditions of Pisa and Genoa were understandably very important for cultural, religious, and political reasons. As a whole, the loot from the Pisan expeditions to Palermo in 1063 and to the Balearic Islands in 1113-14 contributed, for example, to build the city's new cathedral, which I also included many pictures of in the background of this video. The Genoese participation in the capture of Almeria in 1146-47 and in Tortosa in 1148 was undertaken on the promise of a third share of the two cities and freedom from toll throughout Castile and Catalonia. And also with the prospect of controlling the valuable trade in Almeria's silks. This dynamic is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, it's just like the one of the Latin Empire in 1204. These people could get chunks of land because technically they were contributing to that third. You see, this was a contract. They were fighting. There was a Catalan Aragonese army on land that besieged a place like Almeria, and you had the Italian ships besieging, blockading it from the sea, and also participating to the assaults, etc., to the siege, engineering, and so on. So they negotiated at the beginning of this cooperation to say how much is owed to us. In this case, the Italians get 1/3, and they want this 1/3 to be also the essentially about trade, right? They want freedom from toll, significantly enough. They want to pay taxes to these guys that will eventually control the place, and they especially want the monopoly on the most valuable trade in a place like Almeria. That was silk, understandably enough. These people thought to be crusaders. I mean, this is part of the Reconquista. It's part, again, of coordination with the papacy and these Italian navies. So everything is literally planned, right, in that sense. It's not random. It's not just like one day these guys woke up and decided to make a raid or this stuff. No, it was all internationally negotiated. There is a massive work in the various chancelleries and the various, representative institutions in diplomacy to make this stuff work, right? And it happens very effectively, by the way. There was, of course, a cost, like in this too, like such expeditions would burden Genoa with debt, right? But they enhanced the reputation of the city as a powerful place, so as a stable power, which is what make investment come in. And also just a Christian reputation. These people believed that, again, if their imperium was manifest, as we will see now, we hinted at Pisa before, their power was God's blessing, was the Holy Ghost descending on them because of their virtue, and so the rightful action of expanding their own power. It's the fully traditional view. During the Emperor Frederick's visit to Italy, it's the first time in 1154 and eventually also in 1158, this maritime republics did feel threatened a bit. Like before we said, just they had everything to earn from the empire. Yes, but in a way they were also wary, just like other, let's say, interland ones about imperial power. They didn't want simply somebody to march in there and dictating them conditions, right? He could do that if he gave something in exchange, if it was a temporary situation that would bring income, just also say strategic advantage as well against enemies of the city and so on. So Frederick had, as we were saying before, a pretty energetic, also aggressive mentality in his own regard. So Genoa and other cities at that point and their citizens pointedly gave the emperor exotic gifts and declared themselves to be crusaders who had subdued the barbarians from which this loot came from. This was particularly important because, as we were saying before, this was the Holy Roman Emperor, Holy Roman emperor. And these cities were imperial subjects, bearing the cross and the eagle in their insignia, and claiming we fought against the enemies of the faith that are also barbarians, right? The Indo-European concept of course, the chosen race being, just orderly, rational, superior culturally, and the rest being barbarians. They're stupid brutes with no intelligence and order that lose because, of course, God does not provide the winged glory to. Here is the meaning, the common language that we're speaking, right? Spoils from Al-Madiya were set up in the heart of Genoa, and the consuls of the city placed an inscription on one of the new city gates celebrating the capture of these towns, these Islamic towns. This is incredibly important. This tells you literally what they believed in, what they identified to, what their values were, above all, and the pride and prestige of these accomplishments. It's important to speak of Byzantine trade and commerce at this point, because today we focused on Italy, but of course, aside from the fact that part of Italy during this time was still Byzantine, the power of the empire of Constantinople, as you know, during the 11th to 12th century, under the Komnenians, before the disaster of 1204, of the Angel of the Angeloi, and up to most of that point, we had expanded, in fact, dramatically, to say the least. I have a pretty hefty Byzantine history playlist. I mean, the Byzantine Empire was freaking huge, and had reached Croatia, southern Italy, Syria, Crimea, had destroyed Bulgaria, had even basically before Myriokephalon actually reconquered the Anatolian hinterland. Right, it was nothing deterministic about the end of the Byzantine Empire. The proof that Manzikert was not a death blow is again that literally by 1176 the Anatolian hinterland had been rebuilt. Like, the Byzantine Empire had a massive power. It had massive problems, there's no doubt about this, but Wu didn't. As we've seen, the Italians were quite present in Constantinople, but not only. So in order to understand how much they profited by milking this cow effectively, one must understand what this beautiful Byzantine cow was really about. This was definitely, especially the 12th century, an unprecedented time of prosperity for the Byzantines, right? Again, happening despite of the losses in Anatolia. I made videos about this specifically. I mean, the rural production, population growth, all pointed at this expansion. It was not a, just like for the West. I mean, this Italian cities are sort of punctiform in the fact that they accumulated all this wealth within them, but of course the rates of growth, even though clamorously enormous, I think the largest in history in relative terms, because I don't know any growth like the one of medieval Europe in just Western Europe between the 12th and 13th century. It's shocking to acknowledge in the first place. But overall, it's, in absolute terms, of course, ridiculous for today's standards. In any case, the expansion of the empire had occurred through military conquest, so all this enormous boundary was now larger, right? And it depended effectively on a single capital. I mean, the Byzantine Empire was Constantinople. There was practically no other true city in the empire, just Thessalonica, basically. The other were towns at best, right? So very different from the West, where you have all these, in fact, dramatically large cities that are pop up like mushrooms, especially in Italy, but also elsewhere. So it's a completely different picture. And of course, a completely different society, a completely different economy, mindset, culture. We'll talk about this. We have already done it in some other video, but this was important because the meeting of these two cultures was, had the outcome that you know. It was actually a dramatic one, but it also, of course, a hybrid, right? Until Giotto, you realize, and some other artists like Cima, but for example, Italian artistry is very influenced by the Byzantine one still, right? It's very new. It's more Apollonian. It's more delicate. It's also more Gothic. Italy essentially has this hybrid between Gothic and Byzantine style that make it, more, say, characterized. Made a video about, especially the Italian Trecento, that shows a bit, at least the historical, say, how that thing happened, also in a social, in a political sense. Who did commission this stuff, etc. In any case, such enormous, gigantic and Leviathanic Byzantine Empire, just for the sheer amount of resources contained, stimulates dramatically trade. So imagine you have this dramatic punching and penetrating force like the Italian maritime republics had. You have this enormous thing full of riches. Guess how it ends, right? So of course it was true that some Byzantine provincial towns prospered. Consumer cities depended upon landed wealth. Crete was essentially the backyard of the Komnenois. It's just where the imperial house drew literally their everything from, personally, just as a house, as a family. There was some commercial and even industrial development elsewhere, stimulated in some cases by state investment. But we don't have to let ourselves fooled by the entire picture. I mean, basically, I studied the history of Byzantine commerce back in university, and basically it's not before the very end, like in the 15th century, we can start finding something similar in kind of dynamism and still by osmosis to, for example, to Italian banking, to some kind of more, even just, they didn't have as much capital concentrated as the Latins did, right? Nor that freedom of movement. In part, this, as we will see, had provided with important privileges to imperial merchants as such, but Byzantine society was crystallized, where it was much more, pronoia had fundamentally dominated. It's a bit like the later Ottoman Timars. You do not have that commercial, financial dynamism. It's a largely agricultural world with very few active centers, and so even if by some degree you see by the 12th century some development, it's not close to what you see in the West. And it's just an absolute increase, not much. There is, however, some trade, of course, occurring not just with the Italians. For example, Russian traders flocked to Constantinople. We also know that Byzantine merchants traveled to Vladimir, and at about the same time, we see Byzantines actually in Barcelona and Montpellier, because the Jewish merchant Benjamin of Tudela, in his voyages from Spain to Italy to Greece, etc., told us about this. There was some important town development in the lower Danube, in eastern Bulgaria as well, because that was also the end of the branch of a Silk Route coming from the east. Historically, Hungary was a big economy, just salt trade from places like Salzburg in Austria to Constantinople itself. They passed through there, so there would be obviously an economical activation. Macedonia has some demographic, agricultural, so urban development. We say urban, but still we're talking towns fundamentally. These are places that hadn't, again, witnessed the level of urbanization of some areas of Western Europe. The most striking growth outside Constantinople, however, was in a relatively unexpected way in central Greece. We're talking Thessaly, Peloponnese, right? There was much new building. There were some mercantile aristocracies there that were trying to autonomize themselves from Constantinople to some degree. By 1170, Al-Miras in Thessaly, that is not recorded before the 12th century, was flourishing because her port was being visited by the Venetians, the Pisans, the Genoese, and other merchants. We were dominant, right? But we're helping these centers to grow, consequently. They cared about having, say, certain markets that they could make more politically autonomous from such a statalistic system like the Byzantine one. Thebes was a thriving center. The Jews there wove silk and made purple. Corinth was, of course, a relevant center. The Venetians there had already been purchasing silk and oil since 1088. It was really at its peak in the 12th century, where you find pottery workshops, glass factories, as well as quite an active silk textile industry, right? So you see that through foreign investment, this relative decentralization, and just local resources, because that's how it happens mostly. It's the centers exist only because there is a surplus from the countryside that allows that. That this development happens. So what was the relation between Italian merchants and Byzantine economy exactly? Because it's not such an obvious issue. Like, politically speaking, it is, because at some point these polities take very specific postures and act in certain ways, and they go even at war with the Byzantine Empire, etc. There are, as you know, brutal episodes, also the massacres of Latins or stuff like that in Constantinople and elsewhere. It's a bit of back and forth, a drama. Again, sort of toxic dependency relations. But you can't unsee that Italian trade was actually expanded Byzantine economy, not undermining it. You know, if you take economy separated from the rest, which is not really how it works indeed, but if we talk just that, of course, the Italian trade influence was positive. Also, it was not really so radically pervasive as one may think, right? It was actually often of limited extent, meaning that economy is economy as a whole. It has to do mostly with the agricultural output, so the Byzantines do not really feel threatened by again, the Italian presence for, like, I don't know, they're just making us lose capital or something like that. No. They reason mostly in terms of, you know, what can these guys do with their fleet, for example. If something goes wrong, these guys can literally, start sacking the cities, stuff like that. As we were saying before, even though we're not so well documented, like for Western Europe, and especially places like Italy, for these obvious reasons, well, we have a lot, right, at this point, documentally. For the Byzantine society, we don't, right? It's not something that produced sources in the way the West did. Absolutely not. But we can guess from what we see that Byzantine merchants may have actually been operating under the a control, of course, of the state. This may have been a problem for them because since their position was institutionalized, their autonomy was limited. But at the same time, they were enjoying facilities in the form of coinage, credit mechanisms, interest rates, right, that were definitely much greater than the ones, for example, the Venetians were obtaining in the empire. That was the largest ones any foreigner had there. So, of course, the Byzantine Empire was somehow conservative economically, but we understand that there was a dynamism within it that is somehow obscured historically, and that at some point went lost also because of the collapse of the empire itself. Again, nothing, like we have to write history because of that, but still something you want to mind in relation to some, of course, resistance that the merchants themselves had towards the Latins. Right? Consider that Constantinople produced herself luxury items such as silk robes, bronzes, ivories, mosaics. I mean, it's full. Even archaeologically speaking, our museums are filled with that stuff from Europe to America, because there was a dramatic output, which at this point is surpassed just by certain countries in southwestern Europe, because they were the more, or places like France, right? So more, not southern Europe entirely, but still connected to the most advanced places. Definitely, Byzantine economy was much bigger at this time than say the Central Eastern European one, in spite of some important and rapid growth. In Northern Europe, even faster in relative terms than in Southern Europe, but because of course they were nascent economies. They were going fast and were trying to, also in the wake of this other, the Byzantine one is very exemplificative of this, right? So there is really a lot to say, especially regarding the context between the Italians and say the countries north of the Alps, because there was a deep inter-exchange between the two sides, and this was all one with, of course, the just even saying imperial policies, etc. So there is a broader implication always that, again, purely economically oriented studies do not see, because the people that for generations studied history of economics largely were Marxists, so materialists, structuralists, socialists, if not communists, and so they couldn't care less about the spiritual reasons that make people trade with a place rather than another, beyond mere gain, or how they can exploit that gain politically or militarily, etc. So again, looking at history in a purely economical way is not just wrong, but even just as a biased preference, just an incredibly narrow way of just a narrow way of thinking. Alright, so we'll keep talking about these topics again. Again, I have a pretty hefty medieval Italy playlist, so if you're interested in other topics, but we haven't covered too much after all, because some of, as you understand, I insist a lot in certain views in general, but it's a long-term process, right? You must need. You must say these things first, otherwise also the rest doesn't really make too much sense. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.